Hey everyone, I'm Veronica. I'm a software engineer at LinkedIn working on the video team on their flagship app. I work in New York City out of the Empire State Building. Recently, I led a lunch discussion at work. I didn't want to give a talk. I wanted to learn from my coworkers instead. During the discussion, I asked the group 3 questions. Their answers surprised me. I'd like you all to keep these questions in mind during this talk. In my lunch group, no one was a member of the ACM, which is the Association for Computing Machinery, including me. We'll still be covering the ACM Code of Ethics because it's our best hope for a mainstream code of ethics for software engineers. I'd like to hear from any existing members afterwards why they joined and the value they get from it. For example, iOS apps must pass the App Store review guidelines, which are quite strict. At LinkedIn, we also have training for new hires on our members first approach to privacy. The idea of being members first has actually come up in team discussions. Learning from other people's ethical dilemmas is important, and I'm grateful to everyone who's publicly posted their ethical dilemmas for others to learn from. With these larger questions in mind, this is our roadmap for the next 40 minutes. We're going to look at existing codes of ethics, specifically the ACM's Code of Ethics for Software Engineers. Next, we're going to see what we can learn from designers. And finally, we're going to look at integrating ethics into our day-to-day work. And here we're going to learn a lot from journalists and the code of ethics at companies. This will be the only philosophical jargon that I'll use in this talk, but it's an important distinction to make. There's 2 major approaches to ethics that you'll come across on your ethics journey. The Kantian view is an objective perspective relative to a defined universal law. That sounds complex, but we can think of that as a code of ethics that all software developers should follow. That's actually not the only approach to ethics. There's another approach that's based on virtues and values. And this approach is interesting because, as you can imagine, we have a hard time predicting what will happen in the future. Focusing on virtues and values allows us to be prepared for any ethical challenges that come up in the future without being able to predict them. Shannon Valor is a professor at Santa Clara University in California, and she's an author of a book called Technology and the Virtues. She's who I'd recommend if you want to learn more about this other approach. This talk will only focus on the Kantian approach, which is focused on codes of ethics. First, we're going to talk about a code of ethics that's thorough. It's focused on ethics, and it's for software engineers. This sounds great. This is exactly what we're looking for. Unfortunately, it's not widely known, and it's only enforceable for members of the organization. The ACM has had a code of ethics that hasn't changed since 1992. The ACM is currently doing a large project to get an updated version complete by next year. Here are some key facts about the ACM. So it's the world's largest computing society. It has 100,000 members throughout the world. More than half reside outside the US, and it has offices in the US, China, and India. One estimate I found was that there are 21 million professional software developers in the world. So ACM membership makes up less than 1% of all software developers in the world. The ACM has some major projects going on right now, and you can be a part of them. In addition to revising the code, They'll be revising enforcement procedures, which is a key part of any ethical code. And they're going to develop some new media to promote integrity in the profession. We'll be looking at draft 2 of the code, which was released for public comment in April. The third draft is planned for September. And after each draft, there's a public response period. Reading through all the feedback is really overwhelming. It feels like drinking from a fire hose. One piece of feedback that stood out to me was how long the code currently is. If I had a magic wand for improving this document, I would start by making the whole thing less than 5 paragraphs long. Someone has spent hundreds of hours writing a beautiful essay on ethics and computing, but it's a bit windy. One of the main questions that I got at my lunch discussion was, why did you keep reading? And what is this code of ethics really about? You all are probably wondering that too. And it really is a hodgepodge of different topics. It covers volunteering, accessibility, copyrights, collecting data about users, keeping clients informed about the progress of projects, and how to handle self-changing systems. It doesn't come with a nice one-liner for what this code of ethics is really about. And I was thinking, what if I were to create a one-liner? What would that look like? My one-liner is, the public good comes first. We see this theme woven throughout the whole code. We can see the public good cited in such various sections as respecting the work required to produce new ideas, inventions, and other creative and computing artifacts, along with how access computing and communication resources only when authorized to do so. Overall, the ACM Code of Ethics is not enjoyable to read, and it is very wordy. And I'm saying this as someone who read draft 1 and draft 2 in totality and compared the two. We'll see later that not all codes of ethics are like this. Next, we'll learn about the enforcement policy. Until recently, the official enforcement policy was not distributed via the web. The current policy is dismal. It requires direct involvement of the ACM president, executive director, and council. And members sanctioned through the process remain anonymous. So there's no way to avoid working with someone who's been sanctioned for some sort of ethical breach. This is quite different from how the ACM handles plagiarism. When a paper published by the ACM is found to contain plagiarism, the ACM informs the author's employer and posts this information publicly and permanently in the ACM digital library. So it's important to update this enforcement policy. But that won't be included in draft 2 of the code. It'll be in the bylaws, not the code itself. So that is currently in the works and to be determined. Along with this new code and this new enforcement policy, we'll have some new media to get the word out about ethics and software development. We're going to have a podcast. I love podcasts. We're also going to have an Ask an Ethicist advice column. And I'm a huge fan of advice columns. I read Dear Prudence every day. So I would really love this. And there's also going to be short and long form YouTube videos and a playlist of recommended videos. This all sounds great. It's awesome that the ACM is trying to revise the code and get the word out about ethics and more practical applications. One big question you might have is this code of ethics used by anybody? Does it have any real-world implications? According to the ACM, the code is often used in court cases, the most high-profile being Oracle versus Google. At issue in this court case was whether Oracle could claim copyright on Java APIs, and if so, whether Google infringes on those copyrights. When it implemented the Android operating system, Google wrote its own version of Java. But in order to allow developers to write their own programs for Android, Google Google's implementation of Java used the same names, organization, and functionality as the Java APIs. So here's a rough timeline. In May of 2012, a judge in California ruled that APIs are not subject to copyright. Oracle appealed this decision. 2 years later, the Federal Circuit issued a decision reversing the judge's ruling and finding that the APIs are copyrightable, but leaving open the possibility that Google might have a fair use defense. Google filed a petition asking the US Supreme Court to review the federal court's decision. And finally, in 2016, a jury unanimously agreed that Google's use of the Java APIs was fair use. So what is fair use? The final decision for a fair use case really comes down to the discretion of courts and the judge. So one easy example to think of is a parody. If you're parodying a popular pop song, you could imagine it could be very difficult or expensive to get permission for those copyrights. And when you make a parody, you're really making something new that's making fun of the original work. So judges consider these 4 factors for a fair use case, but again, it's really up to the discretion of the judge. So we'll see what part of the Code of Ethics was quoted in this court case. It was, unsurprisingly, about honoring property rights, including copyrights and patents. This was quoted by Oracle's attorney, which is interesting to me because a lot of computer scientists would say that Oracle was not taking the morally superior stand here and being the best citizen of the software development ecosystem. The Electronic Frontier Foundation filed an amicus brief in support of Google's position on behalf of 32 notable computer scientists, including the inventor of C++. We now see that the new draft has been updated to include fair use. And it makes me wonder whether the ACM wanted to be more in line with the law, or if this is what they believed the whole time. This is one challenging thing about reading a code of ethics that doesn't have much context or reasoning inside of it. You see the update, and you might not even know it's about this Oracle versus Google court case. You see what the expectations are, you don't see why they changed. We'll see later that not all code of ethics are like this. Some are great at anticipating questions and providing context. The ACM Code of Ethics is important and worth discussing, but it doesn't have a day-to-day impact on most of us. So I'm going to move on to a code that does have a day-to-day impact on all of our work. This code is one that all iOS developers know about. Tough luck if you don't follow it. It's thorough. It's not only focused on ethics, and it's really for everyone involved in the process of making apps. That is the App Store Review Guidelines. It has a section on safety. For example, you can't have apps that physically harm people, shock or offend people, or if you all remember that awesome game where you threw your phone in the air, harming the phone. So you also see privacy, which, as we know, is very important to Apple. But accessibility is not mentioned, which is interesting, but there are some good reasons why accessibility might not be a requirement. It would first be easier to make accessible apps easier to discover on the App Store. There's an occasional accessibility section, but it's not permanent. Second, it would increase time to review apps. And we've all been super happy about how much time to review apps has gone down. This would be an unpopular decision. Also, Apple does the minimum necessary by default, But I know from following accessibility standards at LinkedIn and now Microsoft standards is that a lot has to be done above and beyond the default to make the app usable and enjoyable for people with disabilities. There is also subjectivity to whether apps are considered appropriate for the App Store. It comes down to the kind of app store that Apple wants to cultivate. Now we'll get into some ethical dilemmas and see how working with designers and product managers better will yield better ethical decisions. There's a highly popular blog post called "The Code I'm Still Ashamed of." It tells the story of a software developer who was working with a medical client. They wanted him to build a quiz. You answered some questions about yourself, and it would recommend the drug that was applicable to you. The design of the quiz made it clear it was targeting teenage girls, and the quiz recommended the client's drug in almost all cases. The only case it didn't recommend it was if you were already prescribed that drug. The quiz was posing as a general information site, but it was really an advertisement for a particular drug. Where things get more dark and sinister is that it turned out one of the main side effects of this drug was severe depression and suicidal thoughts. Right when the client invited his team out to a steak dinner to celebrate how great they did at executing the project, he heard news that a teenage girl killed herself after taking the drug. His product manager pointed out that the quiz was broken before they released, but the software developer said that's what the client wanted, and that was the end of the conversation. I see our role as software developers as not just refusing to do ethical things that clients, designers, and product managers ask us to do, though that is an incredibly important part of our jobs. We also need to work with them. In this story, both the developer and the product manager were at fault for carrying out this unethical product. I'm going to focus now on what we can learn from designers. Designers have their own code of ethics from the International Council of Design, and an awesome book called Tragic Design, which is the most interesting and practical book about ethics I've come across. First, we'll look at the ethics for the starving designer. This was an undergraduate thesis from a student in Singapore. He found no local discussion about ethics, and it wasn't covered in the local design schools. Existing works he found were by authors in other countries, and he didn't think they'd fit the local context. The awesome thing about his thesis is that it gives the reasoning behind what he includes in his manifesto. It gives a clear sense of what ethical guidelines exist for designers, and the pressures they face. For example, a big pressure he faced was going into advertising and the ethical dilemmas that leads to. He does a literature review along with focus groups and interviews. I'd much rather see more research like this into existing codes and what makes a good code than a new code that doesn't make its reasoning clear. By comparing different codes of ethics, David was able to come up with a standard for what a successful code needed. First is usefulness. It needs to cover the challenges faced by us, by software developers. For example, I will be true to myself is not useful. Here, David focuses on how an ethical code should be feasible regardless of how successful you are. Say you really need the money, and the client is asking you to do something unethical. What do you do? He wants the code to provide realistic alternatives to turning down a project. For example, being able to donate time or money to a worthy cause at a later date. David also emphasizes that he wants people to have personal codes of ethics that will make the final call. So it's less for him about the rules of the code being feasible and more about the expectations about how to follow the code. My approach is quite different. I see feasibility as an aspect of the code itself. Can you actually follow it? As we'll see later, realistic expectations aren't the only thing you need. A code can provide enough examples, and it can also use precise language to avoid confusion and ambiguity. It can also be achieved by equipping people to make ethical decisions themselves, which David leaves as an exercise to the reader. Finally, it's important for him for a code to have universal appeal. That means it should be applicable to people with different philosophical, religious, personal, or professional systems of belief. David often uses this example. Should you not work on projects that propel beliefs that are contrary to yours? For him, there's a democratic point of view that on one hand values freedom of choice and expression, and stresses that all views have the right to be represented, even if you think they're reprehensible. However, for David, there's a line. That doesn't mean that someone with a democratic point of view would advertise tobacco to children, which has been quite popular in the past, because that's clearly harmful. But a utilitarian developer, when faced with a project that's against their views, would reject it, because any views that are counter to theirs are not utilitarian. So he just wouldn't include that in his code, because people with different beliefs would reach different conclusions. So there's one part of the ACM Code of Ethics that I see meeting these three requirements. And that's only the minimum amount of personal information necessary should be collected in a system. It's specific to our work, and it's feasible because it still allows us to collect some data. But there's definitely room for people with different beliefs to disagree about what's necessary. The definition of necessary is left as an exercise to the reader. David's resulting manifesto is more about how you put your ethical code into practice, rather than an ethical code on its own. Because it's based so much on defining your own personal ethical code, it requires a lot of work, and it's difficult to enforce. One issue with codes of ethics is that they tend to be dry. They don't inspire you. They're not fun to read. Tragic Design is an amazing book that brings to life ethical issues for designers. And it describes really fascinating case studies like the Ford Pinto, which when you backed up, it could explode and catch on fire. And Ford actually did a cost-benefit analysis and decided that the cost of fixing it was not worth the benefit of lives saved. And how some engineers at Ford who really cared deeply about safety in this issue found an alternative solution that did make sense from a cost-benefit analysis. So it's filled with fascinating case studies like that one. Many designer ethical codes I found talked about aesthetic beauty, functionality, and environmental impact. But they don't talk about how design made people feel. The chapters in Tragic Design put that front and center. Design should not kill. It shouldn't anger. It shouldn't sadden. It shouldn't exclude. One really popular example you might be familiar with is Facebook's Year in Review feature. For people who had a great year, seeing the year in review was awesome, or just a normal part of their day they didn't really remember. For people who, say, lost a loved one in the past year, it was really upsetting to see that. One way you can avoid these kind of unintentionally harmful features is to have a sad sheriff. It's kind of like an on-call rotation where someone in the group is assigned to look at a new feature you all are making and think, if I was sad, if I was angry, if I wasn't seeing good news, how would this make me feel? And it'll make you think about different options. For example, allowing people to opt out of these features. Now we're going to get into the final stretch. Why is it so hard why is it so hard to act ethically as software engineers? We face time pressure, and we're rewarded when we follow the spec. When you're not dealing with an ethical dilemma, this expectation makes so much sense. If an engineer is not regularly following the spec or building to requirements, that would cause lots of issues for the team. And we're already trying to jam cleaning up technical debt, learning, mentoring, testing, contributing to open source projects, trying to jam it all into our already jam-packed schedules. For a while, I've been leading the retrospectives and postmortems on my team. I also review a lot of code on my own team and on other teams. I'm known on my team as a testing evangelist. I'm the instigator behind why our testing has improved so much. These big changes, like going from 0 to 100 on testing, come from little things like leaving comments on code reviews, talking in stand-up about the test you're writing like it's real work, and bringing up issues around testing in our retrospectives. Another way we could integrate ethics into our everyday work is to have an ethics style guide for your company. Many teams have style guides for their code. It makes so much sense. Often differences in code style come down to personal preference, like tabs versus spaces, and it makes sense for everyone to follow the same pattern, regardless of what that pattern even is. An ethics style guide also seems odd, though, because why would an organization share that its ethical requirements are less than another? Think of an established company versus a startup. A startup has smaller users, assuming they're not working in a very sensitive space where negative impact is huge. So we can imagine they might have smaller users, and the impact of their ethical decisions are smaller. They also just have less resources, and they need to make decisions quickly. They might also be working in a new field where ethics is not yet established. This doesn't let startups off the hook, but it will give more context for why their ethics guide would be different from that of a larger company. To illustrate this, let's compare the ethical codes for the New York Times versus BuzzFeed News. The New York Times Code of Ethics is the most remarkable and awe-inspiring ethics style guide I came across. The remarkable thing is that even though it's 57 pages long, and I did not even read all 57 pages, but I read a lot of it, you can distill it into one sentence. That's what we felt like we lacked with the ACM Code of Ethics. The goal of the New York Times is to cover the news as impartially as possible, without fear or favor. Here's some high-level facts about the New York Times Code of Ethics. It hasn't changed since 2004. And more information about enforcement, and I didn't really see anything about a journalism-wide code of ethics being applicable as well. Right from the beginning, the BuzzFeed News Code of Ethics is completely different. BuzzFeed News has the opportunity to help shape a new standard for a new generation of media. Here's some high-level facts. Again, they couldn't be more different. I'll give you all some time to look at this chart. I read through the BuzzFeed Code of Ethics, and then I mapped it to the New York Times and saw interesting similarities and differences. By looking at this chart, it's not clear that, say, the BuzzFeed News Code of Ethics means BuzzFeed is way less credible. or that the New York Times is clearly behind the times and their code is no longer relevant. It's way more complicated than that. And on a lot of bread and butter journalism topics, like anonymous sources and political donations by journalists, they're the same. To illustrate the difference, I'll give an example. This is from BuzzFeed News. This seems straightforward. If you're interviewing a source, you should pay for their lunch or pay for their drink. Let's see what the New York Times says on the exact same topic. Even though this topic defies hard and fast rules, it is essential that we preserve a professional detachment free of any whiff of bias. Staff members may see sources informally over a meal or drinks, but they must keep in mind the difference between legitimate business and personal friendship. A city hall reporter who enjoys a weekly round of golf with a city council member, for example, risks creating an appearance of coziness, even if they sometimes discuss business on the course. This gives me so much memorable imagery, and there are several examples after this one. The biggest difference I saw between these two codes of ethics is ownership. New York Times Code of Ethics goes into a lot more detail with specific examples. It anticipates clarifying questions, and it also covers the reasoning for certain decisions. After reading part of this ethical code, I feel confident that I understand journalism ethics, and I would know what to do if I woke up one day and was a journalist there. The BuzzFeed News Code of Ethics would involve a lot of clarifying questions for me to feel confident that I could make ethical decisions. The New York Times Code fills me with pride at the centrality of ethics to the job of their journalists. So much thought and time went into developing this. It's also worthwhile to compare a more established company with a startup. It makes sense that your ethical guide would be less developed if you're moving fast and you don't have many resources. Also, if you're doing new things involving new media and social media that aren't covered by previous ethical guides. The awesome thing is that if you understand the reasoning behind a given code, you feel that ownership, and it gives you the freedom to challenge yourself and explore new areas while being at peace with your ethical decisions. This is why ethics is for everyone. Developers and designers and journalists and doctors can all learn from each other to build quality ethical codes that inspire ownership over ethical decisions. Thank you.